Hello, and welcome to myfinanceteacher.org. Happy upcoming new year to everyone. And since we've nearly finished with 2019, let's have a look at some of the most interesting assets have done during this year. And let's also have a look at which of the assets the investor should be interested in and which the investor should be cautious about. Before we continue, let me remind you guys to subscribe to the channel if you haven't and click that bell notification. Thanks a lot. We'll only have a look at four assets: the US dollar, the general stock market, crude oil, and gold. But before that, let's start with the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve. An expansion of the balance sheet of the Fed, as it happened here in the second half of 2019, simply means that central bank is printing money and either putting it into the bond markets by buying bonds and reducing the interest rates, or shoveling the money into the repo market, as is the case in late 2019. So looking at the year as a whole, generally the balance sheet of the Fed has increased by about 3% during 2019. So quite a lot of dollars have been printed, especially over the recent few months, and you would expect the value of those dollars to decline. You would expect some inflationary pressure. Well, let's have a look at the dollar index. What happened during 2019? Since the beginning of January, the dollar index has gained nearly 2%. It looks like the dollar strengthened during 2019. However, remember, this dollar index is simply a strength of the dollar versus other fiat currencies. And given that a lot of central banks all over the world are printing money like there is no tomorrow, we see dollar actually strengthen even though the Fed has also followed a loose monetary policy. Looking at the intermediate cycles in the US dollar, it's clear that one of these cycles took place between early January and late June, and possibly another intermediate cycle took place between early June and finished in late October, early November. That implies that we are currently in another intermediate cycle which has already broken below the previous low, and with still several months ahead of us until we see an intermediate cycle low, that would imply much weaker dollar over the next several months. If this is the case, that might be quite positive for gold going into early 2020, although there is also a chance that the intermediate cycle that began in the middle of 2019 has only actually finished at the end of December, and we might see a short-term bounce in the dollar. This is not my primary scenario. I think it's more likely that we are observing an intermediate cycle that is only 2 months old and already in the declining phase. RSI, this is only 7-week RSI, is far from oversold levels, showing that dollar can indeed become much weaker before RSI dips into that oversold level. Next, let's look at the stock market. S&P 500 since early January, and that's even without taking into account that late December low. Since early January, S&P 500 has gained 28%. And at the moment, it's relatively high above its 20-week moving average. Besides that, looking at RSI, again, 7-week RSI, we are far into overbought territory. And taking into account the normal duration of the intermediate cycle in the S&P 500, we've seen one cycle again taking place between December and June, and it looks like we are still within the same intermediate cycle all the way since June 2019, which means with these cycles generally lasting for about half a year, I would expect S&P 500 to correct significantly over the next couple of months. That actually also might be quite positive for gold prices. Next, let's have a look at crude oil. Again, since early 2019, crude oil has gained 29%. And that, again, is without taking into account this December low. Connecting oil with gold, energy is one of the most important cost factors for miners, so you might expect some sort of correlation between crude oil and gold prices. So if oil has gained 29% in 2019, that might be positive for gold in a relatively longer term. Looking at RSI is not that close to overbought levels yet, so crude oil might actually inch somewhat higher over the next couple of weeks. But looking at the normal duration of these intermediate cycles, we've seen one cycle between December and June 2019. And again, I think we are in a cycle that's been ongoing since June, which means this cycle is due for some sort of a correction again over the next couple of months. At the moment, I'm not really interested to buy crude oil when it's this late in an intermediate cycle and somewhat stretched above its 20-week moving average. But if I see a significant correction down into mid to low 50s, I think that could be a nice buying opportunity. And lastly, moving into gold for dessert. Since the beginning of 2019, gold has only gained 18%. So it's lagging a little bit behind the stock market and crude oil, and that also might be a positive sign. Because if there is indeed some inflationary pressure, then gold might have to do some catching up over the next few months. And I think that's exactly what's going to happen. Looking at intermediate cycles, the previous one lasted between April and November, and I think we are in a new intermediate cycle. And the advancing phase of this intermediate cycle is probably going to last all through the first quarter of 2020. And looking at RSI, although RSI is somewhat close to overbought levels, still, I think much higher prices in gold are very likely. For example, I think 1600 in another few months is a piece of cake, as we see in the previous intermediate cycle when the run-up of the first few weeks brought this RSI close to overbought levels, but significantly higher gold prices were followed by RSI deep into and embedded into that overbought area. So at the moment, I'm already all in with my precious metals portfolio. And if you think the current prices are somewhat high, because we've already seen a nice run last week, remember the advancing phase of an intermediate cycle should last for at least a couple of months. And I still think there is a lot of potential left in gold and other precious metals. With that in mind, I wish you a very pleasant 2020. I hope you will enjoy this run-up in gold with me. All the best to you guys. And as a present for me, why not hit that like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't, hit that bell so you don't miss anything new as well. And good luck in your trades.